The global consciousness recognizes this land from a single year, perhaps two. A name that arrived in the lives of millions through a glowing screen positioned between disparate broadcasts beneath a flashing headline attached to a map never previously studied. It is a place understood almost entirely through the lens of the worst thing currently happening to it. The tragedy is real, immense, and deserving of every ounce of attention it receives. But the flashing lights of the evening news offer only a flat, two-dimensional projection of a reality that is deep, layered, and ancient. To see this place only through the prism of its modern crucible is to arrive at the theater during the final act of a play and believe the story began when the curtain rose for the climax. The thing happening to this land is the newest line on a page that was already more than 1,000 years long when the modern world was still a collection of unmapped forests. Start with the sheer physical scale of this vastness. To comprehend the geography is to challenge the narrow borders of the screen. One could fit the entire United Kingdom inside this country more than twice over. It is the largest nation lying entirely within the European continent. 600,000 square kilometers of territory that touches 7 different countries and 2 seas. From its western mountain ridges to its eastern agricultural plains lies a distance greater than the span between London and Rome. It is a land of 1,500 rivers, of deep canyons, and of a sweep of ancient grasslands so vast that historical travelers remarked a rider could gallop for a week and see nothing but the unbroken horizon where the grass meets the sky. This is not a mere province or a buffer zone. It is a geographic titan, a sprawling heartland that has quieted the ambitions of countless empires, simply by being too vast to comfortably hold. Beneath 1/4 of this immense territory lies a silent, dark miracle that has dictated the flow of human migrations for millennia. It is a kind of soil so rich, so deep, and so fertile that geologists and historians have granted it a specific name, Chernozem, the Black Earth. It is a soil that holds water and nutrients like no other earth on the planet, containing an organic richness that turns the landscape into one of the most productive agricultural basins in human history. There is more of this dark soil here than anywhere else on Earth. It is a resource so incredibly valuable that throughout history, foreign armies have marched across the continent not for gold or oil, but to possess these fields. In dark eras of occupation, conquerors even tried to scrape up this sacred black earth and carry it away to their own empires by the trainload. This soil has fed hundreds of millions of people who will never know its name, and it has buried the armies of those who came to steal it. To find the origins of this persistent land, one must look away from the soil and turn toward the water. The story begins at the river. The Dnieper runs for more than 2,000 kilometers, carving its way from the northern forests down through the heart of the plains to empty into the warm currents of the Black Sea. It is the spine of the nation, the blue highway that made all subsequent history possible. Long before modern nations drew their lines, the ancient Greeks knew this water. The Vikings navigated its currents. For centuries, Viking longships swept down this massive river, their wooden hulls laden with furs, amber, and honey from the far north, bound for the glittering markets of Constantinople, returning with hulls filled with silver, spices, and silk. They called it the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. It was a trade route that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, a corridor of cultural exchange that laid the foundation for the first great Slavic state. For most of its historical length, this vital river was not a smooth journey. It was broken by 9 great rapids, roaring stretches of white water where the river crashed over massive granite barriers, throwing foam into the air and making navigation impossible. At these 9 points, travelers had to haul their heavy wooden vessels out of the water and drag them over the raw earth, vulnerable to the arrows of nomadic raiders who waited in the high grass. In the 20th century, Soviet industrial planners built colossal concrete dams to drown these legendary rapids beneath a series of calm, vast reservoirs to generate electricity for a modern empire. The thundering white water was silenced, buried beneath the deep, quiet pools of the artificial lakes. Yet the river still performs the same elemental function it did 1,000 years ago. It carries the country from the northern woods to the southern seas. At a dramatic bend in this river, where the flat plains suddenly rise into a series of high green hills, a city grew that would become the spiritual and political heart of the Eastern Slavic world. This is Kyiv, one of the oldest capitals in Europe. By the year 1000, when London and Paris were still damp settlements of timber and mud, Kyiv was already a glittering metropolis of stone palaces and golden-domed cathedrals, home to over 50,000 citizens. The princes who ruled from these green hills took their faith from Constantinople in the year 988, and with that faith came the Greek alphabet, the stonemasons of the Byzantine Empire, and the long, stubborn memory of writing. Under a ruler known as Yaroslav the Wise, the city reached the zenith of its medieval power. Yaroslav established a great library, founded schools, and set down the Ruska Pravda, one of the very first written codes of law in the Slavic world, establishing a society of order and literacy long before the signing of the Magna Carta. The influence of this golden kingdom reached into the highest courts of Western Europe. Yaroslav married his daughters to the kings of Norway, Hungary, and France. His daughter Anna walked across the continent to become the Queen of France, carrying a sacred Slavonic gospel book upon which French kings would swear their coronation oaths for centuries. Anna signed her royal decrees in an elegant, practiced Cyrillic script, while the French barons and nobles surrounding her court could manage only a crude cross of wax to signify their consent. This was a place of sophisticated diplomacy, of high art, and of a deep connection to the wider world. It was a civilization that seemed poised for an endless golden age, built on the wealth of the river and the fertility of the black earth. Then, in the winter of 1240, the horizons blackened. The Mongol armies of Batu Khan arrived at the gates of Kyiv. They surrounded the high wooden walls, set up their massive stone-throwing catapults, and battered the city into submission. The destruction was total, absolute, and merciless. A European traveler passing through the region a few years later wrote that he counted barely 200 houses left standing among the vast fields of human bones. The mother of cities was erased from the map, its palaces burned, its libraries scattered, and its people slaughtered or enslaved. By all the rules of history, this should have been the end of the story. The city should have faded into a footnote, an archaeological curiosity buried beneath the weeds of the wild steppe. But the city returned. It always returned. The green hills were too strategic, the river was too vital, and the memory of the people was far too stubborn to let the place stay empty for long. From the ashes of the Mongol conquest, the foundations of the old cathedrals remained, waiting in the silence. Among these ruins stands St. Sophia Cathedral, begun in the year 1011. Inside its cool high nave, the original gold mosaics still catch the light of flickering candles. High in the curve of the apse stands the mosaic of the Virgin Mary, her arms raised in eternal prayer. The local people call her the unbreakable wall, Through every fire, every siege, every invading army that has ever broken the gates of the city, this wall has never fallen. She has stood through the Mongols, the Tsars, the Soviets, and the modern missiles, looking down with golden, unblinking eyes at a history that keeps breaking around her feet. If you are ready to embark on this epic, untold story of a land that refuses to be erased, take a moment to drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. Hit the like button, subscribe to Vistanomad, and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming cinematic explorations. Let the journey begin. Not far from the golden domes of St. Sophia, where the high green hills of Kyiv slope sharply down toward the wide banks of the river, the earth itself opens into a labyrinth of silent passages. This is the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, the monastery of the caves, founded in the year 1051 by a hermit monk named Anthony who sought absolute solitude in the dark clay of the river bluffs. Over the centuries, other devout souls joined him, carving out a subterranean city of narrow, low-ceilinged corridors, tiny cells, and underground chapels. Within these cool, lightless depths, the air remains still and chilled, smelling of damp earth and centuries of burning beeswax. Here, the bodies of the early monks were laid to rest in niches cut into the walls. By some silent, mysterious preservation of the subterranean climate, these bodies did not decay. They mummified naturally, their skin turning to dark leather, their hands remaining crossed over their chests in eternal repose. For nearly 1,000 years, pilgrims have descended into this sacred underworld, holding a single slender candle to guide their steps through the shadows, searching for a connection to an eternal realm where the wars of the surface cannot reach. And yet, the city of Kyiv has never stopped building downward, transforming its subterranean geology into a sanctuary for both the soul and the body. Deep beneath the modern streets and the ancient monastery walls runs a modern transit system, and at its deepest point sits Arsenalna metro station, plunging an astonishing 105 meters below the pavement. To descend to its platforms is to ride a series of massive, fast-moving escalators for over 5 minutes into the quiet womb of the earth, watching the sunlight fade into the artificial hum of the fluorescent tunnels. This station was not built so deep merely to navigate the steep topography of the river hills. It was engineered during the height of the Cold War with a dual purpose. In an era when the threat of total annihilation could drop from the sky at any moment, this deep transit platform was designed to serve as a massive fallout shelter, a pressurized vault capable of keeping tens of thousands of citizens alive beneath the shockwaves of a changing world. It is a striking realization that this capital has always lived with the intimate, heavy knowledge that it might, at any moment, have to go underground simply to survive the forces of history. But if the earth beneath Kyiv is a monument to survival, the life lived above ground is a testament to an even more stubborn defiance. To walk these streets today is to encounter a society that absolutely refuses to behave like a population under siege. In the face of dark horizons and interrupted power grids, the cafes remain open, their windows glowing with warm light. On the sidewalks, the heavy metal generators hum like a chorus of mechanical cicadas, keeping the espresso machines running, and the laptop screens illuminated even when the city's central heart is temporarily silenced. Artists who were forced to flee the ruined studios of the South and East have gathered in these historic neighborhoods, hanging new exhibitions in makeshift galleries, creating a vibrant, defiant cultural renaissance in the very shadow of persistent danger. Weddings are celebrated in the ancient stone courtyards, the laughter of guests momentarily drowning out the distant wail of air raid sirens. This is a culture of everyday readiness, an unspoken agreement that life must not be postponed, that joy is a form of resistance, and that the present moment must be lived to its absolute fullest when the ground beneath one's feet is not guaranteed. This profound resilience, this willingness to stand firm on unstable ground, is not a modern invention. It is a deep, historical inheritance that can be traced back to the wild plains south of the capital. In those wide open spaces where the river once ran through the untamed grasslands of the steppe, there emerged a unique society that would define the spirit of the nation for centuries to come. These were the Cossacks. They were not an ethnic group defined by blood, but a brotherhood of the free composed of runaway peasants, serfs, and dissidents who fled the suffocating feudal control of northern Tsars and western Polish landlords. Escaping into the wild, unmapped territories below the great thundering rapids of the Dnieper, they gathered on the island of Khortytsia and established a fortified stronghold known as the Sich. Here, beyond the reach of any king's law or emperor's decree, they forged a self-governing society based on a radical military democracy. On the Sich, every man was equal. They elected their leaders, the hetmans, by public assembly, shouting their votes into the open air and throwing dirt on the heads of those chosen to remind them of their humble mortality and their duty to the common soldier. Those who joined this brotherhood cast aside their past lives, abandoned their family names, and took new, often earthy and mocking nicknames, swearing their ultimate loyalty to the democratic assembly above any earthly lord. From their island fortress, they built light, swift wooden boats called chaikas and launched daring raids across the treacherous waters of the Black Sea, challenging the maritime supremacy of the Ottoman Empire. In the quiet evenings, gathered around the roaring campfires under the massive sky of the steppe, they would sit in silence and listen to the kobzari, the blind, wandering bards who traveled from camp to camp, plucking the many strings of their instruments, and singing the long, melancholic epic poems that recorded their battles, their losses, and their unquenched thirst for liberty. The warrior and the poet belonged to the same horizon. One wrote the history with the sword, while the other carried it in the breath, ensuring that the memory of their freedom could never be captured. In the year 1710, far from the sweeping plains of the steppe, a group of scattered warriors gathered in exile. Their cause was seemingly lost, their leader Ivan Mazepa was dead, and their lands were partitioned by voracious empires. In this dark hour of displacement, Mazepa's successor, a brilliant diplomat named Pilip Orlik, was elected hetman. Surrounded by defeat, living in foreign courts with almost nothing but his pen and his memory, Orlik did something that the world had almost never witnessed. He drafted a document titled The Pacts and Constitutions of Laws and Liberties of the Zaporozhian Host. This was not a plea for mercy or a simple military charter. It was a fully realized revolutionary constitution. Decades before the founding fathers of the United States would gather in Philadelphia, and long before the French Revolution would shatter the absolute monarchies of Western Europe, this exiled leader laid down the radical blueprint for a free and democratic state. It set strict limits on the power of the hetman, separated the executive authority from the legislative council, and guaranteed the rights of the common Cossack against the greed of the ruling elite. It was a document born of a dream, written in the elegant Latin script of scholars, outlining a society built on mutual agreement rather than divine right or noble birth. Orlik would spend the rest of his life wandering the courts of Europe, fruitlessly seeking support for his cause, dying in poverty and exile in 1742. He never saw a free homeland. He never returned to the banks of the Dnieper. Yet, the paper survived him. It stood as an immutable proof that the desire for self-determination was not a fleeting rebellion, but a structured, permanent truth that could wait in the shadows of empires, waiting for the ground to clear. But the Cossacks left behind more than ink on parchment. They left a code woven into the very fabric of their everyday lives. To walk through a village on the steppe was to see the vyshyvanka, a simple linen shirt embroidered entirely by hand. The patterns of these shirts were not random decorations, nor were they mere folk art designed to catch the eye. They were a sophisticated visual language passed down from mother to daughter across thousands of years. The precise geometries, the repeating diamonds, the intricate spirals, the deep red and black threads were talismans of protection, fertility, and identity that traced their lineage back 6,000 years to the ancient Tripilian settlements that once farmed this very soil. For the Cossack riding into battle, the embroidered thread along the collar, the cuffs, and the chest was believed to protect the soul from the entry of evil, serving as an invisible armor woven by the hands of someone who loved them. The shirt was a map of home, a tangible piece of the land itself carried on the body into the jaws of death. This was never a museum piece frozen in the glass cases of historical archives. The chain of this weaving has remained stubbornly unbroken. Today, across the cities and villages of the nation, the vyshyvanka is worn with a quiet, fierce pride. On the third Thursday of every May, the entire country participates in a silent demonstration of unity, donning their embroidered shirts to walk the modern streets. Children wear them to their classrooms, young couples wear them to their weddings, and soldiers wear them under their heavy, ceramic body armor on the front lines of a modern crucible. A shirt that began in the mists of prehistory as a protective charm has become a living, breathing statement of who they are, a declaration written in thread that they cannot be erased. Alongside the needle and thread stands an even more delicate marvel of cultural preservation, the paisanka. This is a simple chicken's egg, transformed by lamplight into a dense miniature cosmos. Using a tiny, funneled metal stylus called a kistka, a grandmother sits in a quiet kitchen, painting lines of hot, molten beeswax onto the fragile shell before dipping it into natural dyes, repeating the process layer after layer, color after color. When the wax is finally melted away over an open flame, it reveals a breathtaking map of ancient symbols. Suns, deer, stalks of wheat, and continuous geometric lines that run on with no beginning and no end. These patterns are older than Christianity, carrying pagan prayers for the return of the sun, the fertility of the black earth, and the protection of the household from the winter's cold. The process requires a stillness of the hand and a patience of the mind that cannot be rushed. It is a form of writing that requires no ink, a sacred library written on the most fragile substance in nature. To look at a paisanka is to realize how incredibly close this culture has always lived to total silence. If a single generation of grandmothers had failed to sit by the fire and pass the stylus to the hands of a child, this entire 6,000-year-old library of meanings would have shattered and vanished forever into the void of history. Yet the chain did not break. Through famines, occupations, and the systematic suppression of local identity, the kitchens kept their candles lit, and the eggs were painted every spring. This stubborn persistence is mirrored in the pagan festivals that still dictate the turning of the calendar year. On the night of Ivana Kupala at midsummer, when the forests are thick and green, young people gather on the riverbanks. They weave elaborate wreaths of wild forest flowers, set small candles floating on the dark, reflective waters to seek signs of their destiny, and leap hand in hand through roaring bonfires under the open sky. It is a wild, beautiful rite that is far older than the churches that tried to absorb it, a direct communion with the elemental forces of water, fire, and soil. and in the dark of midwinter, when the plains are choked with snow, comes Malanka. Whole villages fill with masked figures, tricksters, and characters dressed as goats and bears made of thick braided straw, moving from house to house with ancient songs and theatrical mischief to drive the old year out. These are not staged tourist performances. They are the automatic natural actions of a people who understand that their survival is intimately tied to the repetition of these ancient cycles. Yet, the stubborn insistence on existing on their own terms has cost this land more than almost any other on the European continent. In the 1840s, a young man named Taras Shevchenko began to write. He had been born a serf, the legal property of a wealthy landlord, and had spent his childhood teaching himself to paint and write by the flickering light of stolen candles. When his brilliant talent was discovered, a group of prominent artists pooled their funds to buy his freedom, allowing him to legally own himself for the first time in his life. Shevchenko began to write poems in Ukrainian, the everyday language of the villages, a tongue that the ruling empire did not consider a real language at all, dismissing it as a mere peasant dialect. His poems, gathered into a slender volume titled Kobzar, spoke directly for the dispossessed, the serfs, the forgotten warriors of the steppe, and the silent suffering of the land itself. The empire understood exactly the danger of these words. Shevchenko was arrested, pressed into military service, and exiled to the desolate, windswept shores of the Caspian Sea. To ensure his spirit was broken, the Tsar himself added a line to his sentencing in his own hand. Under the strictest supervision, forbidden to write, forbidden to paint. For 10 long years, they tried to tear the words out of his throat. But Shevchenko wrote anyway. On tiny crumpled scraps of paper using a minute's secret hand, he composed his verses and hid them inside the soles of his worn leather boots, walking across the dusty parade grounds with the soul of his nation literally beneath his feet. He died in 1861, just 1 year before the serfs were finally freed, having owned his own body for only a fraction of his life. But the book survived. In the decades that followed, the imperial government formally banned the printing of Ukrainian books and the teaching of the language twice, declaring by royal decree that the language did not exist and would never be allowed to exist. And the language did what the things of this country always do. It retreated into the safety of the kitchens, into the quiet hum of lullabies, into the geometric threads of the embroidered shirts, and it waited. It survived. To hear these stories of survival is to look at our own lives through a different lens. Have you ever held onto a fragment of your own heritage, a word spoken by a grandparent, a recipe written on a yellowed card, or an old object kept on a shelf, knowing that if you let it go, a piece of your history would die? What is the invisible thread that keeps your own family's story unbroken across the changing years? Share your memories and thoughts in the comments below. Let us read them and keep the global chain of remembrance alive. If these stories of quiet defiance have moved you, please hit the like button. Share this video with those who appreciate the deep currents of history. The journey shifts away from the flat plains of the steppe, where the horizon runs forever under a massive sky, traveling far to the west. Here the landscape begins to wrinkle and rise, the soft black soil of the plains giving way to a great, forested arc that curls down out of Central Europe and comes to a dramatic rest. These are the Carpathians, a majestic wall of green and stone that serves as one of the great ecological lungs of the continent. The highest peak in this range is called Haverla, rising just over 2,000 meters into the thin, cold air. To stand on this windswept summit on a clear morning is to look out over endless ridgelines of dark spruce running to every horizon, a sea of green crests and valleys that seem completely untouched by the frantic machinery of the modern world. In these deep, isolated valleys, where the loggers' saws never reached, stand massive groves of beech trees that have never been cut. This is primeval forest, the largest surviving tract of ancient beech in all of Europe, preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. To walk beneath this ancient canopy is to step backward in time, entering a living museum that shows exactly what the European continent looked like, before humanity cleared the land for roads, cities, and empires. Within this green darkness, creatures roam that have vanished almost everywhere else on the globe. The Carpathians hold the largest remaining population of brown bears in the world, with more than 7,000 of these majestic giants calling these woods home. A fully grown male can weigh up to 400 kilograms, moving with a silent, heavy grace through the thick undergrowth. In the spring, they descend to the mountain rivers to feed on the cold currents. In the autumn, they climb back into the high, rocky country to sleep beneath the roots of ancient trees. Most people who spend their entire lives in these mountains will never see one, but the bear always sees them. Alongside the bear lives the Eurasian lynx, the great spotted cat of the northern wilderness. Armed with tufted ears, wide paws that act as snowshoes, and an incredibly silent stride, the lynx is a phantom of the forest. Scientists who study this beautiful predator know it almost entirely by its footprints in the winter snow, by the hidden camera traps it occasionally triggers, or by the quiet remnants of its hunt left behind. It is an animal that has mastered the art of survival through the simple, profound act of never being witnessed. And the gray wolf still runs these ridges, its hunting packs moving like shadows between the dark spruce. Yet the most triumphant story of survival in these woods belongs to an animal of truly monumental scale, the European bison. The bison is the heaviest land animal on the continent, a shaggy, primeval survivor from the long-lost age of the mammoth. By the early 20th century, decades of unchecked hunting and forest clearing had erased this ancient beast from the wild entirely. In 1927, every single European bison left alive on the planet lived behind a metal fence, confined to zoos and private estates. From just a handful of these captive survivors, dedicated conservationists began the slow, painful work of putting the species back together. Today, over 200 of these magnificent shaggy giants walk wild once more through the Ukrainian Carpathians, reclaiming their ancestral trails. They are not yet entirely safe, still depending on foresters to leave out bundles of hay during the harshest winter months, but their presence is a miraculous proof that a creature erased by human greed can be brought back to walk the earth once more. As one looks down from the high ledges where the nimble chamois pick their way along impossible rock walls, the forest reveals smaller, equally miraculous wonders. High on the windswept meadows, the rare Apollo butterfly drifts between alpine wildflowers, seeking the thin, cold air it needs to survive. In the villages far below, the white storks return every spring from their long migration to Africa, navigating thousands of miles to settle on the very same rooftops their parents used. They rebuild their great untidy nests of twigs on chimneys and telephone poles, welcomed by local families who view their return as a profound sign of luck and a blessing on the house. And down in the damp leaf litter of the forest floor, after the mountain rains have passed, one can find something that looks like it belongs to another world. A slug the color of deep electric cobalt blue. This tiny, luminous creature is found almost nowhere else on Earth, gliding silently over the wet green moss like a living jewel, an endemic wonder that most travelers walk straight past without ever noticing. The human souls who inhabit these high slopes have bent their entire way of life around the strict demands of the mountains. These are the Hutsuls, mountain shepherds, who have lived in these valleys for centuries. In the high summer pastures, they still tend their flocks and make traditional sheep's cheese using the ancient methods of their ancestors. To call the sheep across the immense echoing valleys and to communicate between distant ridges, they use an instrument found nowhere else, the trembita. This is a wooden horn wrapped in birch bark, sometimes stretching 3 or 4 meters in length. When a shepherd blows into its mouth, the single low haunting note carries for kilometers through the crisp mountain air. It is a timeless sound that has announced births, weddings, and deaths in these remote villages since before anyone can remember, a bridge of pure sound connecting the human heart to the immense silence of the land. Further down, where the mountains meet the valleys, lies a place where the forest has reclaimed human design in a stunning display of accidental beauty. This is the Tunnel of Love, a stretch of industrial railway near the town of Kleven. For miles, the trees on either side of the tracks have grown together overhead, forming a perfect, seamless arch of vibrant green leaves. As the train passes through twice a day, it trims the branches, keeping the passage clear while the forest continues to wrap its arms around the steel rails. It was never planned by an architect. It is simply what the earth here does when human activity slows down, transforming a cold, industrial corridor into a living sanctuary. On the far western edge of these valleys stands the historic city of Lviv, a place that looks entirely toward the grand heritages of Central Europe. Unlike the eastern plains, Lviv's old town is a breathtaking tapestry of cobbled squares, Renaissance merchant houses, and Baroque cathedrals, wearing its Austrian and Polish heritage like a finely tailored coat. It is a city that has changed hands and names more times than its own residents can easily count, ruled from Vienna, from Warsaw, and from Moscow. Yet, its streets have kept their shape, and its people have maintained a stubborn certainty of their own identity. In recent years, as danger pressed in from other directions, Lviv became a vital refuge, not just for people, but for the culture itself. Museums sent their ancient treasures here to be hidden. Artists and writers gathered in its historic cafes, continuing the essential work of keeping the national song alive. Because that is the deepest lesson this land has ever learned. When an empire arrives to erase you, you do not only fight for the borders. You must also hide the song, carry your embroidered shirt, and preserve the memory where it can never be found. South of the mountains, the landscape flattens and changes once more, turning into the vast, open steppe that rolls east for hundreds of kilometers under an enormous sky. In the height of summer, this landscape becomes an endless sea of brilliant yellow as millions of sunflowers turn their faces in unison toward the morning light. It is a striking visual paradox, a million golden crowns rooted in the deep black earth, feeding on the sun, standing as the truest symbol of abundance and resilience. This generous soil, the fertile Chernozem, has historically turned this nation into one of the most vital agricultural breadbaskets on the planet. Yet, this very abundance once became the canvas for one of the most harrowing tragedies of the 20th century. In the autumn of 1932, the Soviet state under Joseph M. Stalin imposed impossible grain quotas on the farmers of this land. When these astronomical targets could not be met, the state did not offer relief. Instead, it sent armed brigades from village to village to confiscate everything. They took the wheat. They took the seed grain meant for the next year's harvest. They searched the walls of modest cottages, tearing down clay bricks to seize hidden pockets of dried fruit, beans, and potatoes. a law was passed declaring that a starving farmer who gathered even 5 ears of leftover wheat from a harvested field could be shot on the spot or sent to the frozen labor camps of the far north for 10 years. The borders of the Republic were sealed, trapping 22 million people inside an artificial desert of starvation. By the spring of 1933, close to 4 million Ukrainians had perished in a catastrophe known as the Holodomor, death by hunger. While millions starved in their villages, trainloads of golden wheat harvested from this very soil were shipped across the borders to be sold in foreign markets. The state demanded absolute silence, denying that any crisis existed and forbidding the use of the word famine under penalty of imprisonment. Today, this silence has been shattered. On the fourth Saturday of every November, a quiet ritual unites the nation. At a set hour, a single lit candle is placed in the window of nearly every home, a tiny, trembling flame flickering against the autumn darkness to honor the millions who went unfed. But the attack on the farmers was merely the first phase of a systematic campaign to erase the memory of the land itself. For centuries, the history, the identity, and the spiritual strength of this country had been carried by the Kobzari, blind, wandering bards who traveled from village to village with their many-stringed instruments, the banduras. They sang of freedom, of the ancient Cossack democracy, and of a people's right to exist. In 1933, the state announced a grand congress of folk musicians in the city of Kharkiv, inviting the blind singers and their young guides from every corner of the land to celebrate their heritage. Hundreds arrived, carrying their beloved wooden instruments. They believed they were going to perform. Instead, they were boarded onto a train, taken to the edge of a desolate forest, shot and buried in mass trenches, their wooden instruments thrown onto roaring bonfires. The state believed that by killing the singers, they could kill the song. But they did not understand that a song cannot be shot. The bandura was rebuilt in secret. The old epics were passed down in whispers to children who would not be born for decades. Today, the instrument is taught in every music school, outliving the empire that tried to bury it in the dirt. This sacred soil would witness even deeper horrors as the decades marched on. In September of 1941, the occupying German army took the city of Kyiv. On the northwestern edge of the capital lay a deep sandy ravine known as Babin Yar. Over the course of just 2 days, 33,771 Jewish citizens were marched to the edge of this ravine, shot, and buried in a colossal mass grave. It remains one of the single largest massacres of the entire Holocaust. Just 3 years later, in May of 1944, the hand of tyranny struck the southern shores. The Crimean Tatars, a Muslim people who had lived on the Black Sea Peninsula for centuries, were declared enemies of the state. In the span of just 3 days, the entire nation, nearly 200,000 men, women, and children, was loaded onto cattle trains and deported thousands of kilometers away to the dry steppes of Central Asia. Nearly half of them perished from hunger and disease during the journey and the first years of exile. Their villages were given new names, their mosques were destroyed, and their books were burned in an attempt to erase their very existence from history. Yet, across 50 years of forced displacement, they kept their language alive in their homes, singing the old songs of the sea to children who had never seen the coast, waiting for the day when the walls of the empire would finally crumble, so they could return to the peninsula and begin again from nothing. This soil has borne the weight of humanity's deepest shadows, yet it continues to yield sunflowers that face the light. It raises a profound question for the global soul. When the forces of the world try to silence a song or rewrite a history, how does one keep the light of memory alive? What is the story or tradition from one's own ancestry that must never be allowed to fade into the dark? The journey is not yet complete. Far to the south, where the vast steppe meets the warm, salt-scented currents of the Black Sea, sits Odessa. This port city was built in a single ambitious century, designed with grand neoclassical facades, wide boulevards, and a majestic stone staircase descending toward the harbor. Odessa has always been a cosmopolitan sanctuary, a crossroads where Greek merchants, Jewish scholars, Italian sailors, and Ukrainian farmers traded through the same open harbor, giving the city a unique, legendary wit and a defiant swagger. Yet, beneath these sunlit boulevards lies a second hidden city. Winding through the limestone bedrock are the catacombs, ancient quarries from which the city's stones were first carved. Stretching for thousands of kilometers, it is a labyrinth so vast that no one has ever fully mapped its limits. During the darkest years of the last World War, while foreign occupiers patrolled the streets above, hundreds of partisans descended into this absolute cold darkness, living and fighting from the womb of the earth for years. Odessa has always been comfortable existing in two dimensions at once, the sunlit boulevard and the deep, silent tunnel beneath, possessing a soul that cannot be captured because half of it remains hidden. Just inland, the land conceals secrets older than history itself. In the region of Padilia, the earth hides a silent masterpiece, Optimisticna, the longest gypsum cave on the planet, its passages lined with delicate, glittering crystals that have grown in the silence of millions of years. Above this subterranean wonder, the Dniester River has carved a colossal canyon through the soft stone, its high walls striped with the ancient, colorful strata of vanished prehistoric seas. Here, the deep past is something you can touch with your bare hands. In the nearby village of Mezerich, archaeologists uncovered the remains of human dwellings built 15,000 years ago during the Ice Age. These ancient huts were framed entirely from the massive bones of mammoths, their heavy skulls and curved tusks stacked carefully into sturdy, circular walls. On one of these bones, a hunter scratched a series of geometric lines, a pattern that researchers believe represents the oldest map ever discovered by human hands. People have been trying to make sense of this generous, contested landscape for as long as human consciousness has existed. 6,000 years ago, the Trypillian culture built sprawling circular cities here that held thousands of residents, only to ritually burn their entire settlements to the ground every few generations and rebuild them anew from the same dark clay. Layer upon layer, this land has been shaped by a cycle of birth, destruction, and stubborn renewal that makes the rise and fall of modern empires seem like a brief passing shadow. In the east stands Kharkiv, a city that became the showcase for a very different kind of architectural dream. In the 1920s, it served as the canvas for a bold new future, and at its heart sits the Držprom, the state industry building. This is a colossal constructivist fortress of concrete and glass, a mountain of raw geometry featuring towering blocks linked by high, soaring sky bridges. When it was built, it was one of the largest concrete structures in the world, a radical experiment in design that sought to project a future of collective progress. It has been damaged by wars, shaken by modern trials, and repaired over and over, yet its stark concrete lines still stand, a monument to an era that tried to rewrite the human soul through raw geometry. Which brings the story at last to the one headline that almost every person on Earth already knew, the first time a Ukrainian place name became a universal synonym for disaster. It is the 26th of April, 1986, at 23 minutes past 1 in the morning. At a massive nuclear power station near the brand new, modern town of Pripyat, engineers were running a routine safety test on the fourth reactor. The test went wrong, triggering an uncontrollable surge of power that the reactor could not contain. A steam explosion tore off the 1,000-ton concrete lid of the reactor core, destroying the roof and sending a highly radioactive plume high into the night sky, carried by the winds across Europe. In Pripyat, 50,000 residents slept in their beds, completely unaware of the invisible fire falling from the heavens. For a day and a half, life in the model town went on as normal. Children played in the sandboxes, and a wedding was held, while invisible, lethal particles settled silently over the streets. Then, on the afternoon of the 27th, a column of over 1,000 buses arrived. The residents were told they would be evacuated for just 3 days, instructed to take almost nothing. They left their breakfast dishes in the sinks, their books open on the desks, and their laundry hanging on the lines. They never returned. The town was sealed inside a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, frozen forever in the quiet afternoon of its evacuation. For decades, Kornebul was written about as a modern tomb, the dead zone, the place where nothing could ever live again. But then a quiet miracle began to unfold. With humanity completely gone, for the first time in centuries, the land did not die. It began to heal. The dense forests crept back into the abandoned fields. Asphalt roads cracked to yield to young birch saplings, and the animals returned. Today, the exclusion zone has transformed into one of the largest wildlife sanctuaries in Europe. Packs of gray wolves run through the empty villages. Brown bears have returned after a century's absence, and the rare, spotted Eurasian lynx hunts in the silent, abandoned orchards. In the late 1990s, a small herd of Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horses on Earth, saved from extinction in the southern reserve of Ascania Nova, was released into the zone. They took to this abandoned wilderness completely, roaming the outskirts of the decaying city in thriving, magnificent bands, foaling each spring in the most poisoned soil in Europe. Alongside the wild beasts, a few human souls returned as well. In the months following the disaster, a scattering of elderly villagers, mostly grandmothers, simply walked past the military checkpoints and returned to the wooden cottages they were born in. They planted gardens in the contaminated soil, kept chickens, drew water from the old wells, and lived out their quiet years surrounded by a forest filling up with wolves. They called themselves the Samozli, the self-settlers. When asked why they chose to return, they would smile and tell you that a person does not live longer by leaving the only place that was ever theirs. Does a land truly belong to the empires that draw its borders, or does it belong to the quiet souls who refuse to leave its soil? Over the broken reactor, engineers eventually rolled a colossal shining steel arch, the largest land-moving structure ever built, designed to contain the danger for another 100 years. But the deepest lesson of this land is that the story did not end with the explosion, just as it did not end with the Mongol siege, the famine, or the lines of the morning news. The forest grew through the concrete ruin. The wild horses reclaimed the empty squares. The bandura outlived the forest trench. The embroidered shirt outlived the imperial decrees. The Constitution outlived the man who wrote it in exile. This is the pattern of this country. Over and over, across 1,000 years, something here has been marked for complete erasure: a people, a language, a song, a soil, a city. And over, the thing has simply waited at the edge of the cleared ground, returning the very moment the opening arrived. The year you know this country from is real, but it is not the final truth. Its people persist not because suffering is noble, but because the alternative is to stop being who they are. Long before the headlines, there was a country here, old, vast, fertile, layered, and impossibly persistent. It was here before the news found it, and it will be here, beautiful and unbroken, long after the news has moved on. Thank you for traveling with us on Vista Nomad. Stay a while. There is always more of this beautiful, stubborn world to understand.